Hello, I'm Eduardo Gonçalves from the Climate Group, and welcome to Climate TV. Is climate change going to be affecting food production and food security? And is farming part of the solution? With me to discuss this is Roger Johnson, the President of the National Farmers Union in the United States. We're seeing some devastating forest fires in America right now. What sort of impact is that going to be having on agriculture and on rural communities in the United States?
Well, sure it does. I think it concerns everybody. It particularly concerns folks who are in those regions that are fighting these fires. And it's just one of the things that we're going to have to deal with. I mean, you're likely going to all the available scientific evidence surrounding climate change has been saying for years that we are likely to see more and more of those kinds of catastrophic events. And so I'm not here to say that the fires that are occurring here in the western part of the US today are absolutely the result of climate change. Fires have burned all over the world forever. But it is highly likely that there are more fires, that they are more intense fires, that they are fed by more and more dry fuel, that all of which are exacerbated by continuing increases in the amount of carbon and other greenhouse gases going into our atmosphere that have a direct impact on how the climate is changing around us. Everything says that we should expect to see more and more of those kinds of dramatic events.
So how are farmers in the US beginning to adapt to the challenges of climate change?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because I think that adaptation continues whether farmers think that it's a result of climate change or not. They continue to adapt. And do so in a fairly dramatic fashion. They are using different kinds of watering technologies. So in places where irrigation has been used, we've advanced from flood control or flood irrigation to sprinkler systems to very pinpoint applications, both above surface and below surface of the soil. So lots of those kinds of adaptations take place. I talked earlier about the different ways of managing the soil, and there's increasing scientific evidence that as you reduce tillage in the soil and increase the population of microflora in the soil, that you increase the capacity of that soil to absorb shock, if you will. So excess rainfall, excess drought, those kinds of things, excess temperatures, lower temperatures. So we're continuing to learn how to manage our soils better. Farmers are adapting. You're seeing more and more farmers that are using crops. It used to be that when I grew up that a lot of fields were summer fallow. They were left fallow in the summer every other year, every third year, in order to effectuate weed control and to capture moisture. The latest technology now suggests that there's less and less advantage to do that. So there's more intercropping that's taking place. There's more cover crops that are being planted. All of these things tend to conserve more of the nutrients in that soil, keep them in that soil so they don't run off into waterways or they don't volatilize into the atmosphere. So we're continuing to learn more about how to manage agriculture, and farmers are adapting pretty rapidly to that. And they'll continue to do that even as climate change continues to grow and to worsen. We will continue to adapt. But that's not to suggest that we shouldn't do anything to try and slow down the change that's occurring in the climate as well. I think it's a mix of both adapting and mitigating those impacts that we need to be employing. And I think you'll find farmers and ranchers across this country, and I suspect around the world, willing to do both of those things, given the right economic incentives. And I think that's the piece that, as policymakers ponder what to do about climate change, that's the place they really need to focus on, is how can you send the right economic signals so that farmers will continue to do the kinds of things that are good for society, besides being good for their economic bottom line.
What measures would you like to see implemented to help farmers be more effective in that adaptation process?
Yeah, well, there are a number of things. I mean, we were early supporters of the proposed cap and trade legislation that passed the House 5-6 years ago. Ultimately wasn't considered in the Senate. That isn't likely going to materialize again for some long while. But the reason we were early supporters of it is really twofold. Number one, we recognize the need to try and deal with this. But secondly is because it was a means of providing very direct economic signals to incent farmers to do the kinds of things that we want to have done to reduce emissions. And that's not to suggest that cap and trade is the only way to do that. There are lots of ways you can do that. I mean, you can increase the price of cost, the price of carbon. Folks have talked about a carbon tax as a way of dealing with this. You can just do a number of voluntary measures. If we can develop marketplaces that will incent reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, that will allow farmers to adopt practices like precision fertilizer application, like cover crops, like no-till farming, like certain kinds of managed grazing. All those kinds of things have scientifically been demonstrated can significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we can develop policies that will encourage the adoption of those kinds of practices. And as we do that, those kinds of things can be very useful in terms of beginning to provide some sort of mitigation against climate change.
Looking now to biofuels, what role do you think that they have potentially in helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And also, how do you address the question about this potentially being land that could be used to grow food as opposed to fuel for vehicles?
Yeah, okay. So on biofuels, a couple of things I would say. First of all, biofuels, by almost every measure, are better than petroleum. So nothing is perfect. For every action, there is a reaction. And that's true in nature. It's true it's true everywhere. And so let's just stipulate at the beginning that even though biofuels may not be a perfect solution, they're better than traditional carbon fuels, petroleum, coal, natural gas, that kind of stuff that we're mining from the earth and releasing into the atmosphere. The research in the U.S. suggests that even our traditional corn-based ethanol is a 34% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to traditional petroleum products. So it's better than the alternative. So we're continuing to see the cost of petroleum, environmental costs of petroleum increase as we extract those resources. At the same time, the climate benefits of things like ethanol continue to improve because it's a relatively new technology. We're still learning. We're still advancing technologically pretty rapidly. And so that 34% reduction is likely to get better as the years go by. More importantly, it is really sort of what we always call the next generation biofuels, the advanced biofuels, the cellulosic ethanol, the producing energy out of waste products, those sorts of things. All of that technology is more complicated than corn-based ethanol. It's more expensive than corn-based ethanol, but it's becoming cheaper as we make advances there. The likelihood is that the technology will continue to advance very rapidly, and the greenhouse gas emission reductions are much more profound with those advanced biofuels. So we ought to be continuing to work to use biofuels. As to the question about, well, is there a conflict between food and fuel? Are we using land that we could use to raise food, to raise energy instead? I'd say a couple things. First of all, we've always done that. Food is energy, for crying out loud. Food is calories. Calories are energy. It used to be that we farmed with horses and horse-drawn implements, and about a third of the farm was devoted to raising oats and hay and other kinds of feedstuffs to feed the horses, so you could harvest the rest of the stuff that you were selling for human consumption. So it's not like it's this new phenomenon that suddenly we're using corn, which some would say is a human food. Frankly, most of the corn we raise is feed corn. It's not for human consumption anyway. But the point is, we've always used some of our resources for energy production. That's likely always going to be the case. So, and the other part to remember here is that at the end of the day, anyone who is farming for a living has got to make a living. Right now, we're looking at very low commodity prices. Many farmers are struggling financially because the commodity prices have dropped so low that they are below cost of production. So this food versus fuel argument is in many ways, in my mind, just sort of a fallacious argument. We have to have a system that's economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable. We've got to have a balance. Folks need to be able to make money and to do things in a sustainable way at the same time.
And how can emission reducing and carbon sequestering agricultural practices and trading schemes help to tackle climate change in the US and around the world?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and it's interesting to note that our organization back in the mid-2000s, National Farmers Union was actually the largest carbon aggregator in the country. We were working to aggregate offsets that farmers were adopting practices that were environmentally sustainable. They were adopting practices that were demonstrated to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And as a result of adopting those practices, there was an emissions trading scheme that was established. The predominant one at the time, I think, was the Chicago Climate Exchange, that's since sort of gone defunct as a result of the loss of the cap and trade program that was deemed to be coming at the time. And so we were on the early end of incenting farmers to do the right things economically, to adopt these practices that are going to reduce emissions. There's got to be a market for it. And that's the piece that we have to develop as a matter of public policy. At that time, it was mostly a voluntary market that was being developed by larger companies, by corporations that wanted to say that they were doing things environmentally sustainable. And so they were willing to pay for these emission reductions that farmers were able to deliver. And that provided the economic incentive for farmers to do that. But I think emissions reductions based on some sort of economic incentives makes the most sense.
Why is a strong climate deal at the Paris Climate Conference so important to American farmers?
Well, I think a strong deal coming out of the Paris Summit is important for people everywhere on this globe. There's a growing recognition around the world. We have got to begin to deal in a very dramatic way with greenhouse gas emissions, and there should be a role for absolutely everyone to play in reducing those emissions. That's the importance of the Paris Summit: is how can we arrive at agreements globally that are going to involve countries around the world all providing a meaningful role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I think it's important to all of us, as not just farmers, but as humanity.
And finally, what is your message to American and world leaders?
Well, I think that our message to leaders all over the world is just that we need to deal with this problem. It is the problem that this generation faces. It's probably the largest problem that the world faces right now. It needs serious people to sit down and propose and develop and implement serious solutions to it.
I was speaking there to Roger Johnson, the President of the National Farmers Union. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you for joining us here at Climate TV. From everyone at the Climate Group, goodbye.